overflowing with noise, shallow takes, and information that evaporates the moment you hear it, Selenius Media exists for one purpose: to give you depth. Whether the subject is philosophy, psychology, history, science, artificial intelligence, literature, or the shape of the future, every series we publish is built on one idea: that thinking clearly is a form of survival. If you enjoy this program, explore the rest of our library. Every show is designed to stand alone, but together they form a larger project, a guided tour of the forces, intellectual, emotional, political, technological, that built the world we live in and the world we're about to enter. Woodrow Wilson was born into a world divided and left it even more fractured, yet forever changed by his vision. Few American presidents are as contradictory, as intensely moral, and yet as blinkered as the 28th president. He was a Presbyterian minister's son who preached politics as if it were a sermon, a scholar who dreamed of remaking the world through ideas, and a Southern-born progressive who wrapped racial prejudice in the language of order and science. To tell the story of Woodrow Wilson is to trace the arc of the early 20th century, the last years of the old empires, the rise of modern bureaucratic government, the shattering violence of the First World War, and the birth of an American habit of thinking of itself as the conscience of the world. It is also to follow one man's rise from shy, stuttering student to the most powerful office in the United States, and then to watch his body and mind collapse under the weight of his own ambitions. Thomas Woodrow Wilson was born on December 28, 1856, in Staunton, Virginia. But his childhood unfolded primarily in the Deep South, Georgia and South Carolina, during and after the Civil War. His father, Joseph Ruggles Wilson, was a Presbyterian minister and an ardent defender of the Confederacy. The church and the parsonage shaped young Tommy's early world: sermons, Bible reading, theological debate, and a stern moral atmosphere that equated discipline with righteousness. As Union armies marched and cities burned, he saw the Confederacy crumble from the inside. Like many white Southerners of his generation, he absorbed a story of defeat that wrapped itself around notions of honor, victimhood, and racial hierarchy. The war and its aftermath etched themselves into his imagination: the sight of wounded soldiers, the bitter talk of Reconstruction, the determination that the South had somehow been wronged, yet remained noble. Wilson was not an early academic prodigy. As a child, he struggled to read, probably due to undiagnosed dyslexia. He did not learn to read fluently until his teens, but once he did, he devoured history, political philosophy, and oratory. He admired the prose of Edmund Burke, the speeches of British statesmen, and the structure of government in Westminster. Above all, he became fascinated by politics as a drama of character and principle. In a time when many Americans still thought of the United States as a loose federation of states, Wilson began to see it as a single organism that needed direction and leadership. He attended Davidson College briefly, then transferred to the College of New Jersey, soon to be renamed Princeton. There he came fully into his own. The shy Southern boy became the intense, serious, and ambitious student. He joined debating societies, wrote essays on government, and daydreamed about a political career. After Princeton, he studied law at the University of Virginia and briefly practiced, but the courtroom did not hold him. Law, he decided, was too narrow. He wanted to understand the whole machinery of government. He earned a PhD in political science and history from Johns Hopkins University, one of the first Americans to hold such a degree, and turned toward academia. For years, Wilson made his mark not as a politician, but as a scholar and teacher. His textbooks on American government shaped how a generation of students understood the Constitution, Congress, and the presidency. He argued that the United States needed a stronger, more coherent executive branch, one that could act with the energy found in parliamentary systems. The separation of powers, he suggested, had produced gridlock and weakness. Parties and leadership needed to bridge the gaps. He admired British parliamentary practice and believed that, in its own way, the American system could evolve towards something more disciplined and responsible. In 1902, he became president of Princeton University. There, he displayed the same fusion of idealism and rigidity that would later define his presidency. Wilson sought to transform Princeton from a gentleman's college into a modern, merit-based university. He expanded the faculty, emphasized scholarship, and tried to break up the old eating clubs that dominated student social life. He envisioned a more democratic campus where intellectual seriousness took precedence over social status. But his reforms met fierce resistance from wealthy alumni and trustees who resented his attacks on tradition. Wilson pushed hard and spoke in moral terms, seeing his fight as one between principle and privilege. As the conflict escalated, he alienated powerful donors and eventually lost key battles. The bruising experience did not soften him. If anything, it confirmed his sense that any worthwhile reform would provoke entrenched interests to fury. Out of academic politics, a new path opened: state politics. New Jersey's Democratic Party bosses approached Wilson with an offer that seemed almost out of character for such a high-minded professor. They wanted him to run for governor in 1910. Their calculation was simple. They assumed he would be a respectable figurehead who could win over middle-class voters while quietly serving machine interests. Wilson had other plans. Once elected, he broke with the bosses almost immediately and pressed an ambitious progressive agenda through the legislature: workers' compensation, regulation of public utilities, primary elections to weaken machine control. He spoke as if the whole moral weight of the state rested on his shoulders. The public loved it. In just 2 years, Wilson transformed himself from obscure college president into a national figure. The presidential election of 1912 gave him an opening few politicians ever see. The Republican Party was split between incumbent President William Howard Taft and former President Theodore Roosevelt, who bolted to run on the progressive Bull Moose ticket. With the Republicans divided, Wilson, the Democratic nominee, faced a fractured opposition and an opportunity to write a new chapter in American politics. He campaigned on what he called the New Freedom, a program that promised to break up monopolies, lower tariffs, and restore genuine competition. Roosevelt's progressivism focused more on regulating big business. Wilson's rhetoric emphasized dismantling it. Both men claimed the progressive mantle, but their visions differed. In the three-way race, Wilson captured the presidency with a minority of the popular vote, but a commanding electoral college victory. Arriving in Washington in 1913, Woodrow Wilson brought with him not only an agenda, but a sense of mission. He believed that the presidency should be an active, moral force in national life. Unlike many of his predecessors, he gave his own State of the Union address in person, reviving a practice abandoned since Jefferson. He met regularly with reporters, used speeches to appeal directly to the public, and drove legislative priorities with an intensity that stunned observers. Here was the scholar president in action, wielding ideas like instruments of power. The first years of his administration were packed with domestic reform. Under Wilson, Congress created the Federal Reserve System, finally giving the United States a central banking framework to stabilize the economy and manage the money supply. The administration pushed through a graduated federal income tax, made possible by the newly ratified 16th Amendment. Antitrust efforts were expanded with the Clayton Antitrust Act and the creation of the Federal Trade Commission. Wilson supported measures to regulate child labor and improve working conditions. Although progress was partial and contested, he was no mere figurehead. He worked closely with congressional allies, refined legislative language, and often provided the moral argument for reforms in person. Yet there were dark floors beneath the shining architecture of Wilsonian progressivism. His administration oversaw the segregation of federal offices in Washington, D.C., reversing gains made during Reconstruction and the late 19th century. Black civil servants were demoted, separated, or dismissed. When African American leaders protested, Wilson received them politely but remained unmoved, insisting that segregation was a matter of efficiency and harmony. His early writings had praised aspects of the antebellum South and treated Black Americans as a kind of social problem. And now, as president, he acted in ways that reinforced white supremacy. The same man who spoke loftily of self-determination abroad was blind to its meaning at home. Even as Wilson focused on domestic policy, events in Europe were building toward catastrophe. In the summer of 1914, the assassination of an Austrian archduke set off a chain reaction among the continent's great powers. The First World War began as a localized conflict in the Balkans and quickly pulled in Germany, Russia, France, Britain, and others. The modern industrial age now produced modern industrial slaughter. Trench warfare, machine guns, poison gas, and artillery barrages killed millions. The United States, under Wilson, remained officially neutral. "He kept us out of war" became a key slogan in his 1916 re-election campaign. Wilson's neutrality, however, was never entirely detached. American banks and industry increasingly supplied the Allies with credit and goods, and German submarine warfare threatened U.S. shipping. Wilson protested each sinking and pushed Germany toward temporary restraint, but the underlying tension remained. He imagined himself as a mediator who could one day bring the warring powers to the table and broker a peace without victory, a settlement that would avoid humiliation and plant the seeds of lasting order. In 1916, running for a second term, Wilson narrowly defeated Republican Charles Evans Hughes. His supporters highlighted his success in avoiding entry into the European conflict. His critics accused him of wishful thinking. The war refused to stand still. In early 1917, Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, calculating that it could starve Britain into submission before American intervention mattered. At the same time, British intelligence intercepted the Zimmermann telegram, in which Germany encouraged Mexico to consider war against the United States in exchange for lost territories. Public opinion in America shifted. Wilson, who had long resisted the call to arms, now concluded that U.S. entry into the war was necessary. On April 2, 1917, he appeared before Congress and requested a declaration of war against Germany. His speech framed the conflict not as a traditional struggle of power, but as a moral crusade. "A world must be made safe for democracy," he declared. It was a striking, almost theological line, war recast as a kind of armed idealism. For Wilson, the United States was not merely joining a war. It was entering history as a champion of a new international order. Mobilizing for war required a scale of federal action that dwarfed previous efforts. The Wilson administration instituted the draft, created new agencies to coordinate production and transportation, and managed the economy in unprecedented ways. The Committee on Public Information produced propaganda to build support for the war, while laws like the Espionage Act and Sedition Act gave the government broad powers to prosecute critics. Socialists, anti-war activists, and some editors ended up in prison for speech that, in calmer times, would have been protected. Wilson's administration argued that unity and security demanded firmness. Civil libertarians saw an alarming assault on the First Amendment. Once again, high-minded purpose mingled with repression. On the battlefield, American forces tipped the balance. The arrival of fresh U.S. troops in 1918 stiffened Allied resolve, and helped break German offensives on the Western Front. By November 1918, Germany sought an armistice. As the guns fell silent, Europe lay in ruins. Empires that had seemed eternal were collapsing. Habsburg, Hohenzollern, Ottoman, Romanov. Into this shattered landscape stepped Wilson, determined to shape the peace. He sailed to Europe to take part in the peace conference in person, the first sitting American president to travel to Europe while in office. Crowds in Paris and London greeted him like a prophet. Banners proclaimed, "Welcome to the champion of the rights of man," and "Wilson, apostle of peace." He brought with him his 14 points, a program that promised open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, self-determination for oppressed nationalities, and above all, the creation of a League of Nations, a permanent international body that would provide collective security and settle disputes without war. But the Europe he entered was not an empty slate waiting for idealism. It was a table crowded with other leaders, each driven by domestic politics and the desire for security or revenge. French Premier Georges Clemenceau wanted Germany disarmed and constrained, terrified of another invasion. British Prime Minister David Lloyd George balanced the desire to weaken Germany with a need to keep Europe economically viable. Wilson's lofty call for peace without victory had collided with years of bloodshed and public rage. He compromised again and again. The Treaty of Versailles redrew borders, broke up empires, imposed heavy reparations on Germany, and assigned war guilt to the defeated powers. The League of Nations was indeed established, fulfilling Wilson's central demand, but at a cost. He had to accept a settlement that some critics saw as sowing the seeds of future conflict. Still, Wilson believed that the League was the essential piece. If nations could come together in a permanent council, if they could commit, even imperfectly, to collective security and cooperation, then injustice in the treaty might later be amended. The League, in his mind, was the machinery of a new moral order. But back in the United States, a different struggle awaited. The Constitution required that the Senate ratify any treaty by a 2/3 vote. Wilson returned home to face a chamber deeply skeptical of entangling alliances. Some senators, known as the irreconcilables, opposed the League on principle, fearing that it would drag the United States into foreign wars without the consent of Congress. Others, led by Republican Henry Cabot Lodge, were willing to consider ratification with reservations and conditions that would preserve American sovereignty. Wilson, however, saw the League of Nations as a unified structure whose obligations could not be diluted without destroying its essence. He regarded Lodge not merely as a political opponent, but as an enemy of the new world he sought to build. The debate grew bitter. Lodge delayed the treaty in committee, held long hearings, and crafted reservations that would have allowed the United States to opt out of certain League commitments. Wilson refused to compromise. In the late summer of 1919, against the advice of his doctors and advisors, he embarked on a grueling cross-country speaking tour to rally public support. He spoke in packed auditoriums and from train platforms, his voice carrying the urgency of a man who believed history itself balanced on a knife's edge. Day after day, city after city, he insisted that the League of Nations was the only hope for preventing another global catastrophe. The strain was too much. On the night of September 25, 1919, in Pueblo, Colorado, Wilson delivered one of his most emotional speeches, nearly collapsing at the podium. A few days later, back in Washington, he suffered a massive stroke. It paralyzed his left side and left him partially blind and emotionally fragile. For the remaining year and a half of his presidency, he was a severely disabled man, mostly hidden from public view. The country did not fully understand how ill he was. His wife, Edith Wilson, and his physician controlled access. Edith saw herself as a guardian, a steward of her husband's wishes, and she filtered documents and decisions, deciding which matters of state to bring to him in his weakened condition. Some later called her the first female acting president, though she rejected that label and always claimed she was only carrying out his will. Still, the result was a kind of informal regency. The executive branch drifted, half-functioning, while the Senate continued its debates. In the end, the Treaty of Versailles was defeated in the Senate. The United States never joined the League of Nations. Wilson viewed this outcome as a personal and moral tragedy. He had envisioned the League as the capstone of his life's work, the instrument that would redeem the horrors of the war. Instead, he left office embittered and convinced that small-minded men had sabotaged the world's best hope. Yet history is more complicated. The treaty's harsh terms contributed to the grievances that propelled extremism in Germany. The League, operating without U.S. participation, proved weak and ineffective in the crises of the 1930s. Wilson's vision was grand, but it rested on fragile foundations, his own uncompromising temperament, and a domestic political consensus that never fully existed. His personal life and inner character also shaped his presidency in ways not always obvious in legislation or diplomacy. Wilson's first wife, Ellen Axon Wilson, was an artist and a deeply religious woman whose quiet strength supported him through the academic years and his rise in politics. As First Lady, Ellen took on housing reform in Washington's slums, visiting alley dwellings and pushing for better conditions for the poor. Her health declined rapidly in 1914, and she died in the White House that August, just as Europe was sliding fully into war. Wilson was shattered. The intense, self-controlled president sank into a grief that those around him feared he might never fully escape. Less than a year later, he met Edith Balling Galt, a widowed Washington socialite. They married in December 1915. The speed of the courtship scandalized some observers, but Edith's presence brought emotional stability back into Wilson's life. She became not just a partner, but a gatekeeper. Wilson shared with her not only personal feelings, but political anxieties and hopes. She read documents, offered opinions, and carefully managed his schedule. Their partnership would become even more crucial after his stroke, when her role in screening access to the president raised enduring questions about transparency and constitutional practice. Wilson's relationship with public opinion and dissent was complex. He believed in leadership that educates and uplifts, not in following the polls. He once remarked that a leader's job was not to discover where people were going and get in front of them, but to point them toward where they ought to go. Yet he was no stranger to political calculation. His appeals for a second term, his handling of labor unrest, his responses to suffrage activists, all bore the marks of a man aware of tides he could not ignore. During the war, he encouraged unity parades and liberty bond drives that turned patriotism into a civic ritual. At the same time, the administration allowed and at times encouraged a climate in which German Americans, radicals, and perceived un-Americans faced harassment and surveillance. The question of women's suffrage offers a revealing window into his evolution and his limits. For years, Wilson was cautious, treating the issue as a matter for states rather than the federal government. Suffrage leaders split over how to deal with him. Some courted him politely, while others, led by Alice Paul, picketed the White House, chained themselves to fences, and endured arrests and force-feeding. At first, Wilson was irritated and defensive. Over time, influenced by the shifting political landscape and the visible service of women during the war, he moved toward supporting a constitutional amendment. In 1918, he addressed the Senate and argued that granting women the vote was a vital war measure and a matter of justice. The 19th Amendment would be ratified in 1920, near the end of his presidency, though credit for that victory belongs as much to the suffragists as to Wilson himself. The last years of the war and the immediate post-war period also saw rising racial violence and labor unrest at home. In 1919, race riots erupted in cities such as Chicago and Washington, D.C., as returning Black veterans demanded respect and economic opportunity, and white mobs reacted with terror and lynching. The so-called Red Summer of 1919 laid bare the deep fissures that Wilson's high rhetoric had never addressed. At the same time, strikes rocked key industries, steel, coal, transportation, as workers sought better wages after wartime sacrifices. Wilson's administration, preoccupied with the Paris peace talks and then hamstrung by his illness, offered limited and inconsistent responses. Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer launched a sweeping campaign against radicals, leading to the Palmer Raids, in which thousands of suspected anarchists and communists were arrested, often without warrants or due process. Though Wilson was incapacitated during the most intense phase of the raids, they unfolded within the broad framework of a government that had already normalized the suppression of dissent. Abroad, beyond Europe, Wilson's principles collided again with realities of empire and nationalism. Colonial subjects in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East listened closely when he spoke of self-determination. Delegations came to Paris, hoping to press their claims. Vietnamese nationalist Ho Chi Minh tried to petition the conference. Arab leaders sought recognition of independence. Koreans invoked Wilsonian language in their own struggles against Japanese rule. Most of these hopes were dashed. The great powers divided former Ottoman and German colonies into mandates administered by Britain, France, and others. Wilson's influence was limited and selective. His concern for self-determination applied primarily to certain European peoples, not to colonized populations worldwide. The disappointment was profound. Many future anti-colonial leaders would later recall the moment as a kind of betrayal. The realization that American ideals would not yet overturn the old imperial order. Even in Latin America, where Wilson claimed a special American interest in fostering constitutional government, his record was contradictory. He refused to recognize certain regimes he deemed illegitimate, attempted to use moral pressure to shape politics in Mexico, and sent U.S. forces into places like Haiti and the Dominican Republic. He described these actions as reluctant duties aimed at stability and reform, but to many on the receiving end, they looked like old-fashioned intervention dressed in new language. Here again, the pattern emerges. Lofty intention interwoven with control. Ideals compromised by the assumption that some nations were not ready for full self-rule. Physically, the pressures of these choices weighed heavily on him. Wilson was not a robust man to begin with. He had suffered from minor strokes earlier in life and lived with high blood pressure and stress. The pace of wartime leadership, the transatlantic travel, the late-night negotiations in Paris, and the bitter fight at home over the League created a crucible that his body could not endure. The 1919 stroke did not come out of nowhere. It was the culmination of years of strain on a system already vulnerable. After leaving the White House in March 1921, Wilson lived quietly in Washington, D.C., in a brick house on S Street. He was a shadow of his former self, physically diminished, but still mentally convinced of his righteousness. He wrote essays, received visitors, and nursed both his injuries and his resentments. He died on February 3, 1924, at the age of 67. How should we remember Woodrow Wilson? It depends which threads of his story one chooses to pull. One can point to his transformative domestic reforms, the Federal Reserve, the income tax, antitrust measures, the idea of government as an instrument capable of smoothing the shocks of industrial capitalism. These changes helped lay the groundwork for the larger federal stake that would later manage the New Deal and the modern economy. One can point to his rhetoric of national purpose. His attempt to elevate the presidency into a bully pulpit that spoke not only of policy but of morality. One can also focus on the darker strands: his segregation of the federal government, his indifference to black civil rights, his willingness to repress dissent during wartime, his paternalistic view of other peoples, particularly in Latin America, where his administration intervened militarily while preaching self-determination. The man who spoke of a world safe for democracy showed little concern for democracy when it came to black voters in the South or subject peoples in U.S. spheres of influence. His vision of order and righteousness was bounded by race, culture, and his own certainties. Perhaps the most enduring part of Wilson's legacy is not in the specific institutions he built, but in the habit of mind he encouraged. The idea that America has a special role to play in shaping the world's political order. Every time a president frames foreign policy in terms of democracy, human rights, and international cooperation, the shadow of Wilson is there. Every time such policies collide with messy realities, power politics, and hypocrisy, his contradictions reappear as well. In the end, Woodrow Wilson stands as a man whose intellect was vast, whose ambitions were towering, and whose limitations were painfully human. He tried to write a new script for both American government and global politics, and he paid for it with his health and his reputation. Some see him as a visionary betrayed by his country. Others see him as a preacher who mistook his own narrow convictions for universal truth. Both views contain pieces of the man, but neither fully captures the restless, driven figure who stared out from behind steel-rimmed glasses and believed, with a kind of fierce faith, that ideas could organize the world.
Midnight rails under silver moon, dusty boots on a winding road. A shadow's the only friend I've known since she packed up and let me go. Empty whiskey bottle on the seat, her laugh still echoes in my bones. Saddle's heavy with memories. I ride alone where the wind still blows. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. Sunrise paints the horizon gold, but it don't warm a lonesome soul. Every town I pass feels half her size. Every trail's haunted by goodbye. I whisper prayers to open skies, hoping someday my heart'll find a brand new path beyond the pain, where broken hearts can heal in time. Nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be, nowhere else to be. 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 Nowhere else to be.